Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of PHIMCOS, I would like to welcome everyone to the Society's first webinar membership meeting of 2021. I'm pleased to inform you that we have a total attendees of 51, last count of 51 individuals. Our special guest today is a good friend of PHIMCOS and of many of its members. Tom Harper is the lead curator of antiquarian mapping of the British Library. And we all look forward to his presentation entitled Maps, Views, and Everything Else, the Topographic Collection of George III. The collection clearly is one of the major treasures of the British Library, and its significance in size and in content of rare and important maps and images is simply unbelievable. As Tom informed us, the library has reached a major milestone of cataloging and digitalizing approximately 40,000 images, and there are still some to come. This incredible undertaking will now allow everyone or anyone who is interested to access the images easily after more than 200 years in which most of these were safeguarded and kept in the library's archives. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the IT department of Artaland, headed by Jay Borromeo, in assisting us to set up and to manage this webinar. At this point, I would like to ask Lisa Periquet, who will moderate the question and answer session after Tom's presentation, to share with us some procedural matters. Lisa?
Thank you, Jimmy, and good evening, everybody. I'd just like to give a few reminders about the question and answer portion, which will come after Tom's talk. After the talk, there will be an opportunity to ask questions in two ways. And the first is by typing it in. You can type in your question by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom right of your screen. So that's the button that we're going to be used for the questions that are typed in. Alternatively, if you wish to ask a question verbally, you can click on the yellow hand icon. It's also at the bottom of your screen, and we will call on you to ask the question. In this case, just please wait to be acknowledged and remember to unmute yourself before speaking. That's all. Thank you. And over to you, Tom. I think you can start now. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening, all the way from the town of Watford, just northwest of London. Thanks very much to Jimmy for inviting me. Now, it's been, believe it or not, 3 years since I was last in Manila, when I had the opportunity to meet many of you and introduce the British Library's collection of maps of the Philippines. At that time, we were heavily involved in our project to catalogue and digitize the jewel in the crown of the British Library's map collection, the topographical collection of George III, of which work on the maps and views relating to the Hispanic world was generously supported by Jimmy and Connie. 3 years on, I'm really glad to say that we've completed this project. It wasn't easy. It took 7 years. It involved around 38 staff and generated 40,000 catalogue records and over 60,000 images. I am really happy as well that in October of last year, we uploaded 20,000 of these images of the maps and views onto the image sharing site Flickr under a public domain license, meaning that they can be accessed, downloaded, and reused by anybody. In the first month, these pages received a staggering 1.4 million hits. Which I think took everyone by surprise, and we're incredibly pleased. The second lot of images is going to be released in the coming months. Now, one of the key purposes of the British Library is to provide access to its collections to anybody who has a research need for research and enjoyment. as a library which holds the heritage of many nations and cultures, digitization in order to increase access is at the very top of our priority list. And now anyone can explore online the Topographical collection, which we prefer to call KTOP for short. It's a collection that was previously the preserve of an exclusive elite. Now anyone could look at it. Printed and hand-drawn maps and views of the world in its parts of the highest quality, many of them closely related to historical events that pretty much shape the world we live in, I think it's fair to say. Skipping through the digital images on Flickr gives the impression of a smooth and uniform and orderly collection of maps and views. But this is maybe one of the negatives of viewing map collections online, because it masks the collection's really rather complicated 5-century history, during which it was rearranged, altered, and divided up. The KTOP is a complex jigsaw, and it's a product of the many different societies with often very different outlooks. And that's part of what makes it, and indeed map collections in general, I think, so interesting. So by way of introducing the KTOP Flickr image database to you this evening, I'm going to discuss the following. First, I'd like to provide a history of the KTOP, and then I'd like to compare it to the two other main early map collections in the British Library, picking out maps relevant to the Philippines and Southeast Asia where I can, in order to explain how these map collections, and indeed our modern appreciation of early maps, came to be the way it is today. And then I'd like to offer a few comments on the digitization of map collections, such a major activity of modern map libraries across the world. It's emphatically important, but are there any negatives? For example, does it make us feel differently about the originals in any way? Now, although the majority of these collections do not directly concern Philippines mapping, I really hope it'll interest you from the point of view of the history of map collecting, and I look forward to answering any questions on it later on. So let's begin. The KTOP is a collection of around 40,000 maps, prints, views, charts, reports, and other items, dating from between 1500 and 1820, and inherited and collected by George III between 1750 and 1820. It's arranged geographically. About 40% of the collection is devoted to Great Britain, with 10% to the colonies, including the United States of America. 30% of it is devoted to Western Europe, and the remaining 20% to the rest of the world. The former head of maps at the British Library, Peter Barber, said that, Lord forbid, if we lost everything apart from this collection, we would still have one of the finest map collections in the world. And it contains all of the standard maps and atlases one would expect to find, from the Italian atlases of the 16th century through to the Dutch, the French, and British ones up to the 19th century. In addition to these, it contains separately issued maps, wall maps, and charts, and an extremely high number of manuscript maps, hand-drawn ones. There are actually rather more views than maps in the collection, both printed and manuscript, all of the highest quality and often of key historical significance. And there are a variety of esoteric and even unusual items in the collection. Here, for example, is a plan of the king's bath boat, a boat in which the king took a bath, which was kept in Weymouth, the seaside resort on Britain's south coast. Maps have been, from the KTOP, have been exhibited across the world and in London as well. This is a still from Magnificent Maps in the British Library in 2010, which really majored the King's Topographical collection. You'll forgive the plug. The collection has been written about extensively. This is my book from a few years ago, which is packed full of KTOP maps as well. And of course, the collection is newsworthy as well. This discovery of a drawn palace, drawn by the king himself, discovered in the KTOP, made the BBC News a few years ago. To understand how this collection came to be, let's go back to the start. The nucleus of the King's geographical collection is the British Royal Map Collection, and collecting began in 1660 the date of the restoration of Charles II. And the key item in this regard is the Klenk Atlas. This is the vast composite Dutch world atlas presented to Charles to celebrate his accession to the throne in 1660. And here's the map of Southeast Asia from the atlas. You can see the atlas open with the clasps on the edges there. This map was produced in 1652 by Hugo Allard in Amsterdam. It's one of perhaps only 3 examples in existence now. The collection begins in 1660, but given the British monarchy is traditionally traced at least as far back as William I in the 11th century, where did the maps of these earlier monarchs go? Well, happily, the answer is often also in the British Library, which I should say before 1973 was part of the British Museum. So just to explain that I will use British Museum where I'm referring to the collection before 1973. So the royal maps we know of before 1660 tended to have ended up in 2 places. First of all, they found their way by hook or by crook into private libraries of usually high-ranking officials. And these private libraries were gradually assimilated into the British Museum from its foundation in 1753. It's through this route that many of the Tudor maps of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I found their way into the collection through the library of the Elizabethan official Sir Robert Cotton. Now, Cotton's collection is incredible, as well as 2 of the 3 surviving examples of Magna Carta in existence. The Cotton collection includes this famous Anglo-Saxon world map of 1025. This is the only surviving example of what we think a Roman map of the world would have looked like. The collection also includes this chart of 1609, which was made for the English envoy in Madrid, Charles Cornwallis, copied from a Spanish map, which the scholar Robert Batchelor believed to have originated in Manila, with links to the Chinese Selden map now in the Bodleian Library. Now, these maps, according to Batchelor, contain information on shipping routes in and around the South China Sea. The second route into the British Museum for early royal maps was the Old Royal Library. Now, this is the original Royal Library of the Kings and Queens of England, and it was presented to the British Museum in 1757 by George III's grandfather, George II, and it contained bound collections of maps and atlases, such as this Dieppe School Atlas of 1542 by Jean Rotes. This is the map of Southeast Asia and Australia. It's with north to the bottom, just so you can get your bearings. This hand-painted atlas was originally intended for the French king, but eventually presented to Henry VIII in 1542. Now, on another day, this atlas might have been part of the K-top had it been filed differently. But logic doesn't tend to play a great role in how map collections came to be formed, and we're going to see quite a lot more of that later on. So starting in 1660 and running through until the beginning of George III's reign, exactly a century later in 1760, royal maps went into what would become the king's geographical collection. It isn't very easy to establish which maps were added to the collection before George became involved, but there are some clues. For example, the bindings of some of the atlases occasionally provide the names, the arms of some of the kings or queens preceding him. It's also fairly obvious from some of the special presentation maps in the collection. For example, this map, the Duke's Plan of New York, produced in 1664, which shows the town just as it was passing from Dutch to British control. Now, this map was presented to the Duke of York, hence the name the Duke's Plan, and hence the name New York, later James I. Another example of this sort of presentation map is the giant map of China printed, a copper engraved map printed onto 41 sheets of paper that the Italian Jesuit Matteo Ripa had made for the Kangxi Emperor in 1719. Now, Ripa returned to Europe with copies of the map on board an East India Company ship in 1724. He presented a copy of it, this copy, to George I on the 9th of September of that year, and he even annotated it in red ink so that the king could read it. The geographical collection is understood as a reflection of the geographically and intellectually curious nature of George III. A contemporary observed in about 1770 that topography is one of the king's favorite studies. He copies every capital chart, takes models of celebrated fortifications, knows the soundings of the chief harbors in Europe and the strong and weak side of most of the fortified towns in Europe. Above all, maps were felt to be an essential attribute for a king to fulfill his kingly duty in a practical sense. The king was actively involved in matters of state, though his role, like today, was largely a nominal ceremonial one. But also the possession of a map collection had real symbolic power. You know, if you wanted to be a proper king, you needed a proper map collection. The king's librarians scoured Europe for ready-made collections to buy, and one of the best examples of this is the collection of Joseph Smith, the British consul in Venice. This was purchased in 1762 for £10,000, but it includes unique prints such as this one of the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome from the Vatican archives. Smith's collection of canalettos are in the royal collection. Collections would also have been acquired at auction as well, for example, those of the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor. As well as early maps and other materials, it's clear that there was also a constant stream of contemporary acquisitions reflecting current affairs, which the king took an obvious interest in. For example, this map of the Bay of Manila was drawn at the time of the siege, the British siege of 1762. And it's a type of hand-drawn presentation copy of a map of the sort produced by military and naval draftsmen. And a number of these maps would have been originally drawn and distributed to the key high-level figures of whom the king was clearly one. This rare copper engraved map of Manila from around 1739 may also have been acquired at the same time, though we're not exactly sure how. Annotations to the lower right of the map mark actions of British forces in attacking the wall of Intramuros. Of course, it's tempting to think that this might have been George following the action, but we cannot say with any certainty. Given the king's well-known interest in maps, a number in the collection would have been received as gifts. The views of Sydney, Australia, for example, were painted in 1793 by Fernando Brambilla, the artist on board the Malaspina voyage, which had just come from the Philippines via New Zealand. Other examples, the album of maps, views and figure studies produced by William Alexander, who was the official artist of the Macartney embassy to China in 1792. This was presented to the king on his return. And yes, the magnificent manuscript atlas of 1700 showing the coasts of Africa and Asia by William Hack. Now this atlas contains on one of the front end papers the following inscription: presented to His Majesty 10th of November 1800 by Lord Sydney. Now you see what's happened here. George has obviously seen Lord Sydney's copy of the Hack Atlas and expressed a liking for it. What else could Sydney do but present it to the king? Other maps were certainly not originally intended for the king, as they were official, often secret maps produced as part of the business of state, and which would usually exist today in the UK's National Archives rather than its National Library. I'm thinking of some of the maps of North America produced in the 1770s in the run-up to the Revolutionary War. These maps of the coast of Maine, this one in particular, show illegal logging stations which were apparently denying the Royal Navy the use of timber. Now one could only assume that the king asked to see these maps and for some reason or other forgot to give them back. We need to be clear though, George certainly did not actively acquire maps by himself. You know, this picture of him leafing feverishly through dealer catalogues is quite a romantic one, but it's not true. This task was up to his librarians. Nor do we believe really that he played an active part in arranging and curating the collection. That was up to the librarians too. the arrangement of it is essentially how the collection remains today, geographically by county, moving on to smaller regions, and then alphabetically by town or place. Unsurprisingly, this arrangement reflected the British view of the world, with Britain at the start, Britain first, moving on to Europe, with places furthest away from Britain at the end. This geographical ordering was extremely strict, to the extent that the librarians even disbound some world atlases and distributed their contents across the collection. And this has certainly happened in the collection with one, maybe even two Lefreri school Italian atlases of the mid-16th century that were broken up and distributed and spread out across the entire collection. Now, if this is something we might wince at today, it's worth pointing out that precisely the same practice was being advocated from the 1820s by writers and geographers, including Edmé Francois Jomard, who was the then head of the map collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. Now, if there's one thing a librarian likes doing, it's arranging things. And these librarians didn't stop there. The geographical collection was divided up into three distinct areas. First, there was the topographical collection, our K-Top, the largest portion containing maps, atlases, and views of topographical interest. Second, they created the maritime collection, which contained, as you might imagine, sea charts, marine charts, and atlases and sailing directions. This is the smallest of the three. And finally, the librarians created the military collection. Now, this contained battle plans, siege plans, and other maps of military interest. This was effectively the military map collection of George III's uncle, William, Duke of Cumberland. Now, broadly, this division makes sense, I think. You know, three clear and distinct themes, though, of course, you're going to get some overlapping. For example, what about a naval battle? Would you put that in the maritime or the military collection, or a topographical survey produced as part of a battle, topographical or military? We accept that. The problem seems to be with how badly this division was carried out, with a great many military and naval maps ending up in the topographical collection. I mean, not that we're complaining, of course. For example, this map of the naval attack upon Bergen in Norway in 1665 is in the topographical collection, strangely, as are all of the military fortification plans of North America produced as part of the 7 Years' War. Maps of Manila, the siege of Manila, are spread out across both the military and topographical collections for no apparent reason. This map by Edward Cotsford is in the military collection, whereas this plan of the harbour of Cavite is in the topographical collection. Now, I'm inclined to think that there is a perfectly pragmatic reason that's been lost in the mists of time. But of course, and again, we should never rule out chance, accident, or even opportunism. Here is an image of the geographical collection in situ in Buckingham House in around 1820, the year of the King's death. And this is a fantastic wood engraving because we can see the collection as it was. We can see the large volumes and portfolios stacked up. And if you look just below the tables, you can see these little spaces where the rolled maps are to be kept. And at the end of the table there, you've got a whole section with the rolled maps kept there. And this is actually why many of the rolled K-Top maps in the collection today have the prefix at the end of them, tab end, meaning that they were kept, stored at the ends of tables. You can also see in the image two globes. There's the globe right in the center and at the end. These are the globes by George Adams of 1777, which we were able to digitize and turn into 3D models in March of last year. This is the terrestrial globe, which you can view on Sketchfab, which I can forward the links to later if anyone's interested in spinning George III's globes. Following the death of George III in 1820, his son and successor George IV agreed to donate the King's Library as well as the K-Top to the nation. And this happened in 1823. and the material was transferred to the British Museum. The military collection, however, remained in royal hands, and today this is in the Royal Library at Windsor, and you can view these maps. They've all been digitized as well on the Royal Collection Trust website here, and I can supply these links later if anyone would like them. Finally, the maritime collection was given to the Admiralty. However, for reasons relating to the limited use that might be made of out of date and therefore downright dangerous sea charts, it was decided that the maritime collection should also be sent to the British Museum, and much of it was in 1844. The catalogue of the K-top was published in 1829. This is the title page. This is a really early date for producing a map catalogue to be produced. I mean, the main library map catalogue was another half a century away, and the Paris one still later. And the records in this catalogue were used right up to 7 years ago when our recataloguing project began. The old catalogue is actually still really useful because it enables us to trace maps and atlases which, for every reason, became detached from the K-top and found their way into other parts of the British Museum after it arrived there. For example, the terrific Portuguese atlas of 1573 by Fernão Vaz Dourado was taken from the King's Maritime Collection and transferred into the Department of Manuscripts in the 1860s. Now, it's unclear exactly why, but I think the reason is plain just by looking at it. It's a beautiful atlas. I think it probably has a lot to do with internal power struggles in the British Museum. You had very powerful departments, such as the Department of Manuscripts and the Department of Prints and Drawings, and they took their pick from the less influential collections, such as the map department, still a very young department then. And I think the Vaz Dourado Atlas was just extracted because it caught someone's fancy. Map collections such as the K-top had their contents and arrangement defined and reinvented by successive eras who had different priorities and opinions. But I think chance, fortune, and opportunism, as always, played really key roles. And there's a really interesting contrast between the K-top and another very old and significant collection, which became part of the British Library in 1982, the archive of the former East India Company, the India Office. Now, this is the map collection used in the government of India from London between 1600 and 1947. And if there's anything that tells us just how much attitudes to maps and views have changed over the years, it's that India Office Library stamp placed right in the middle of this terrific watercolor. The collection contains around 100,000 historic printed and manuscript maps, charts, plans, atlases, gazetteers, and many other materials. Its principal geographical focus, around 70% of it, is upon the area of modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma, but it takes in adjacent areas and more generally British imperial activity across the world. In many ways, it is an archetypal imperial map collection supporting, as it did, the activities of one of the world's largest colonial endeavors. Yet it's a mercurial and complex collection too. There are some really significant gaps in it. For example, from the period of 1600 through to around 1760, there's virtually nothing at all presumed destroyed or taken. After 1760, more maps are present in the collection. This coincides with an increase in surveying activity. And we have maps such as, for example, William Farquhar's map of 1823 of Singapore. This is one of the very earliest of the town, as we know, which was sent back to London by 1824 and archived. Maps by company officials were also produced as part of increasing activity in Southeast Asia. For example, Thomas Forrest, whose maps of, for example, the west coast of Malaysia were sent to London to the India Office collection. Forrest also spent 8 months on Mindanao in 1775 and 6. And this map of the Sultan of Maquindana was deposited in the British Museum as well. From the 1760s, also hydrographic charts and sailing directions produced by Alexander Dalrymple, who was hydrographer to the East India Company, were acquired. An excellent set of these is in the collection. but not his precious compilation manuscript material, which was bequeathed instead to the Admiralty. Nor did the company acquire Dalrymple's impressive library, which was sold at auction after his death. However, present at the sale and winning bidders on a number of bids, including Dalrymple's manuscript atlas by William Hack, was, yeah, you've guessed it, representatives of George III. There are a number of maps in the K-top for which you would expect examples also to be in the India Office collection. For example, and clearly the 1619 map by William Baffin of India, produced following the embassy of Sir Thomas Roe to the Mughal Emperor. This is, one of the founding cartographic documents of British India. Nothing in the India Office collection there. Or, of course, the map by Pedro Murillo Velarde. Now, this is a notable absence from the India Office collection, and it's difficult to believe that a copy was not at some point in the collection. As we know, the East India Company were beneficiaries in the siege of Manila and the looting of the town in 1762, when, as recorded by William Draper commanding the attack, the copper plates for the map were stolen. Now, if there was any copy of the Velarde map in the India Office collection, I think, sadly, it's likely to have been destroyed. Unlike the K-top, this was a working archive, a working map collection for practical use, not a glamorous royal library. And this heavy use extracted a heavy toll upon the materials. In 1878, the map librarian Sir Clements Markham described maps, journals, and records left to rot and perish, and even sold as waste paper. As for the copper plates, well, I mean, if they ever reached the East India Company in London, it was not usual to retain such things due to the value of the material, and copper plates were very usually melted down. However, a couple of years ago, interestingly, we were able to acquire copper plates used to print James Reynolds' map of maps from the Atlas of India from the 1770s. And this is the copper plate to the right, and this is an article in one of the British newspapers about it. Now, we acquired these copper plates from, of all places, a scrap metal dealer, and it's likely that they were disposed of during the company's move of premises in 1861. Former archivist of the India Office collection, Dr. Andrew Cook, found another such copper plate being used as the mudguard of a tractor on a farm in eastern England. Now, we can only describe these as miracles of survival, and here again we have that word, chance. The rather poor treatment of the India Office records collection is quite unusual in the context of the 19th century. This was the era of the rise of scientific and national European map collections and the beginning of the modern study and appreciation of early maps. The K-top came into the British Museum in the 1820s, at precisely the time when European private and royal map collections in general were beginning to pass into public hands to the state, as the state was creating and asserting their modern identities. National map collections were beginning to become important as repositories of geographical knowledge for practical utilization, and in a national context as symbols of national identity. And I think this concept's hugely important for understanding the basis of the modern European national map library. In the 1820s, Jomard was developing the Royal French map collection on these lines, and he writes, if you read him, about national honor and achievement enshrined in early maps. Jomard was one of the earliest map historians, and in 1854 he published some of the first facsimiles of early maps, lithographic copies of early maps in collections such as the British Museums. Jomard and his rival, the Viscount de Santarem, studied Portolan sea charts with a nationalist dimension, and Santarem's research was even funded by the Portuguese government to support Portugal's imperial territorial claims. National competition even extended to the auction house in Paris from the 1820s. The British Museum battled it out with Jomard and his successors over Portolan charts. The Bibliothèque Nationale won more of these battles, undoubtedly, as you can see from their incredible collection of Portolan charts. But the British Museum did pretty well too, as we can see from this chart, this Pedro Reinhold chart, the earliest we have in the collection to show any part of the Philippines, dated to around 1522. Of course, neither Paris or London could match the Queen of Spain in 1853 over the purchase of the Juan de la Cosa map, the earliest surviving map to show any part of the Americas. The hammer price for this was 4,020 francs, far more than the British Museum had to spend at the entire auction. The symbolism of the ownership of this map was, of course, Spanish imperial power. And this national dimension was one factor in the creation of the British Museum's modern map collection in 1840. This is what we call the general map collection. And today it's by far the biggest single map collection anywhere in the world, apart from in Washington, DC, with about 4 million maps in the collection. With its nucleus as the K-top, it acquired a phenomenal number of maps, views and atlases over the first 2 decades, 50,000 maps in the first 20 years. The big map dealers, Adolphus Ascher in Berlin, Stevens and Quaritch in London, played a key role in supplying maps to the collection. And I think their role in shaping the national collection today is probably not as recognized as it should be. We have all of these invoices in our archives, invoices for individual maps, for example, and this 1885 invoice from Quaritch is for the still unique surviving example of this woodcut heart-shaped world map by Peter Apian of 1530. £36 in 1885, that's quite a lot of money. However, the majority of invoices we have lists many, sometimes hundreds of maps and views, which museum staff would almost certainly not have checked. Very often duplicate maps were purchased, for which examples already existed in the topographical collection and elsewhere. For obvious reasons today, it isn't policy for us to acquire copies of maps we already have. But there we return to this element of fortune and chance again, because although duplicate copies were acquired, and I mean the British Library may have as many as 30 copies of Ortelius's map of Southeast Asia. Although duplicate copies were acquired, other rare and unique maps were also acquired at the same time. The museum acquired the sea chart collection of Admiral Lord Howe in the early 20th century, the majority of which the library already owned, but it also included some real rarities, including the Diaz Romero map of the Philippines here. We must therefore judge this rather broad approach to collecting as a successful one, because despite the duplicates, these treasures also came to us. And of course, is there such a thing as a duplicate? I mean, subsequent cartobibliographical research has revealed many of these so-called duplicates to be either new or later editions, states, and unrecorded variants. All this supports the fact that map collections are not inert and changing, but things which are according to new priorities and perceptions. They change over time. Attitudes to maps have changed even in the 14 years I've been with the British Library. For example, we certainly must look critically at maps and the roles they played in, for example, processes of colonization in a way we would not have done, say, 10 years ago. And of course, we should always fully accept and expect new discoveries in the form of unrecorded or lost maps, and discoveries also in the area of academic research. Now, one area in which this research is likely to emerge is in the digital sphere. And I'd like to just conclude my talk by making a few observations about digitizing map collections. Now, as I said at the start, the British Library is committed to making its collections available to everybody for research and enjoyment. Digitization of our collections and putting them online is therefore a key custodianship role. And we were really glad to be able to get the K-top images onto Flickr, this first batch of 20,000 maps back in October, particularly because it was during a period where people were confined to their homes, and we wanted to provide people with this window onto the past in order to onto the outside world. George III was, in many ways, the archetypal armchair traveller. He never travelled, and so this seemed really, really appropriate to be able to do. So for the first time with these K-top maps and views, anyone can go into the British Library Catalogue Explore, type in a search, select I want this, select the digital item option, and then see the original map onto Flickr. You can even, if you want to, view, overlay, and georeference these maps on our free and award-winning georeferencer tool. And importantly, images have been released under the public domain tag, so everybody can do whatever they like with them. They can download, reuse, the whole thing. But are there any downsides to digitizing maps? For example, might it reduce interest in the original maps? And what about the research in maps? A digital map will provide the researcher with so much, the content or the data of the map. But the last 30 years of research into maps has encouraged us to look at them as physical objects as well. Their scale, their paper, their feel, even their smell as artifacts with stories to tell. And these aren't things that digitization can help. So are we therefore going backwards in a strange way? Actually, that the evidence is that digitization only increases the demand and desire for early maps. Since we've released these maps onto Flickr, we've been contacted by numerous parties and researchers hoping to access the originals. The digital images have made people more aware of what we hold. And of course, there's something about original maps, how they contain links to the past that are powerful to us as individuals, as groups, as societies. That's why we collect, that's why we exhibit and lend maps. That's why essentially we are all here this evening. And I think our goal should be this happy medium which embraces both the original maps and their digital surrogates. Digitization has many examples, and most relevant to what I've said this evening is that it provides the opportunity to link digital collections together. It'd be impossible to reassemble the geographical collection of George III as it was originally constituted, but we can virtually reunite collections digitally. And so one day we will see the military, the topographical, the maritime collections together in a virtual environment. We may even see the India Office map collection also reconstituted, though that would perhaps be a little bit too ambitious. But as always, it's thanks to the support, generosity, and enthusiasm of map collectors and everyone that we are able to contemplate these things as we look to the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was very enlightening, especially the part about the pros and cons of digitizing maps, which I found very interesting. Can we have, for starters, for our questions today, we have a comment from Pedro Luengo, and his comment is, just to keep this in mind, the map of China, which is preserved in Spain, as you mentioned, is very similar to Portuguese maps, which are being studied right now. Maybe these are part of the Iberian Union context. I think he's asking a question about if you think that they're related to this idea of the Iberian Union.
I know there is some, thanks very much, Pedro, and it's lovely to hear from you again. There are, yeah, I mean, this map is incredibly interesting, and I know that there is research happening right now. Robert Batchelor was writing, I think, back in 2013, and I think it's just testament to the strength and the vitality of research in this area that even 5, 6, 7 years ago is almost a different world away. So yeah, I really look forward to seeing what else can be discovered about these maps to pin them together. This is the thing about maps, it's all there in front of you, and yet it's not. And this is really where experts such as yourself come in.
We have a nice question from Julian Candia, and he asks, which is your favorite map?
Thanks again very much for the question. This is the question that one should always prepare for. And yet time and time again, I realize that I've failed to do so, simply because it changes so very often. It really does on a daily basis. And in preparing for this presentation, I've found some more favorites. I think of the maps I've introduced to you this evening, it would have to be the copper engraved map of Manila from around 1739. And I included this in my top 5 maps of the K-top in a blog last year. I just think it's the most extraordinary depiction of a town at a moment in time, and it's a map that doesn't just tell you about the architecture and the layout of the town, but of its institutions and its society and its people. So that's my favorite today.
Would you have an idea of who might have made that map, Tom? I mean, who conceptualized that map in particular? What type of a person?
Yeah, I mean, the history of the map is well documented as well, and I mean, a number of people were involved in it. The Rojas as well, and the map was presented to the governor as well, and it's but it's I suppose like many maps, not the result of a single person, but rather a sort of an oeuvre, I mean, I doubt the map is a completely original one. Would be based on previous examples that have not survived.
Mm-hmm.
One good place to look for the history of the map is, of course, going onto the British Library's catalogue and checking it out, which has a full description and references where you can go to find out more as well. It's Maps K-top 11640.
We have a question from Rafael Lotilla. Tom, are you saying the British Library has 2 copies of the Romero-Gandia map?
No, we just have one. Sorry, what I'd meant in what I said was that this process of hoovering up as many maps as possible in the late 19th century, without sort of checking whether the museum already had those maps, meant that we have a lot of duplicates. But very occasionally through that process, you would find unique examples, and the Diaz Romero map is one of those that just sort of almost by chance, really, happened to find its way in. I mean, it's an extraordinarily rare map as well, and I think there's still quite a lot of work we need to do to fully understand it.
This is a question related to the same map, and it comes from Carlos Madrid. First of all, he says, it's nice to hear the great presentation. Thank you, Tom. Okay. Yes, we have another question related to the same map. It's from Carlos Madrid. And first of all, Carlos says, nice to hear the great presentation. Thank you, Tom. My question is regarding the Romero-Gandia map, of which you showed an image. In light of the research presented in recent years, will the library consider renaming it for Romero-Ekiandea? Thank you again for this informative presentation.
Well, thank you, Carlos. And again, it's lovely to hear from you this evening. And yes, I mean, as you've said, and as I've already mentioned, research in these sorts of maps is incredibly vital and incredibly exuberant at the moment. Literally every few months something seems to be happening. The name of the map is something that perhaps I've been slightly lazy in. I should keep more up to date. On the catalogue, of course, you will see the map described as its title. You will also see as many names associated with the map as we know of. But of course, as things develop, as they are developing, and new names are discovered, we will certainly update our records. And with gracious thanks to the scholarly community for enabling us to do so. Absolutely.
Okay, a comment and a question here from Alfredo Roca. Congratulations, well done. Would you know how many maps of the Philippines are in the British Library? Will all of these be available in the web at some point?
It's a great question. Lovely to hear from you. The goal is that everything we have is to be digitized and made available. Yes, that's what we're aiming for. We have to be ambitious. In reality, of course, that's something that's going to take many years, many decades, due to what we have. In terms of the maps that show the Philippines, and it's a very, very difficult question, and you have to work out whether you're talking about maps focusing just on the Philippines, or whether you include maps of the region, or maps that show the Philippines. And obviously very quickly the dimensions widen incredibly. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something we aim for. It's something we hope to achieve. But of course, it's something that's going to take time.
A question from Andoni Aboitis. Does the Philippines appear in the 1535 Jean Roth's map?
Andoni, good evening, and thank you for the question. And I don't believe it does, but I think we may have to skip back to have a look. Do you think? Should we do that? I think that's probably quite a good idea. It's right at the start, isn't it? So if you'll forgive me. Oh, there we are. I don't think it's there, unless you're looking to the bottom left by the compass rose. It is possible, isn't it? And certainly there are some coastlines there which may correspond with the west coast of Luzon. I think we need a bigger image. I think I need to do a bit of work and get back to you on that one. Would it be possible to communicate that to members later on? Perhaps I could circulate a large file to members, if that would help.
Yeah, definitely. If you have any more information, please send it to us. We can send it when we have the summary of the talk.
Okay. Okay, let's do that.
Distribute. Okay. A question here from Peter Geldart. Do you know when and how Admiral Howe acquired the Diaz-Romero or Gandia-Echeandia map? And how did the British Library acquire Lord Howe's collection?
Good evening, Peter, and thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, Admiral Lord Howe's collection came to the British Museum. It was I think it was in the first decade of the 20th century. Unfortunately, this is something where, not having been able to get to the British Library on site for the past 2 months has rather hampered things. Certainly looking at the rather gaudy ownership stamp on there, it looks to be an early 20th century one. And the answer to that will be in the departmental archives. As to how Admiral Lord Howe acquired his maps, I mean, that is sadly one of the problems with buying in ready-made collections. It's that any of that crucial provenance stuff that we are so good with for material we purchased or acquired ourselves just isn't there. And I mean, you look at the topographical collection. There's a single receipt for the 40-odd thousand maps there. A receipt made out from James Wilde to the Earl of Bute, the King's confidant. So no, we don't. But certainly in terms of when the Howe collection came to the library, I mean, I can again confirm that in email.
Okay, maybe we can include that in your follow-up
Got my
answers.
list of, yes, indeed.
Yeah. Jumping back to the Rhodes map, since it's on the screen right now, Leo Garcia says that Mindanao appears in the Rhodes map.
Right. So.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where. Maybe Leo can be a little bit more precise about where it might be. later
Yeah, we
on.
really do need a close-up, don't we? We really do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one would assume so. I think, you know, given the date, given the place of production of the map, Paris via London, I think so. And I mean, if we look at the Vaz Dorado map of a few decades later as well, that looks rather more basic, but I think it is probably also there as well. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is, you know, 30 years later, but still you have it.
We have another question from Jaime Laya. I remember seeing a pentimento in the Fernandez de Rojas map, indicating an earlier date, 1717, if I remember right.
Yeah, that's right.
So what is the basis for the later catalog date?
I believe that the dating is, because we've approximated it, I believe that the date is based on documentary evidence, I believe, though I can't actually be sure, without having the catalogue record in front of me. One thing that is quite important to us today, which certainly wasn't in 1820 when the K-top was catalogued, is that where we add a date, we have to demonstrate why we have selected that date. One of the really difficult aspects of recataloguing this collection has been looking at dates and trying to work out why such dates were added. Usually it was simply a guess by cataloguers back in 1820. You're right that the cartouche of the map, you can just make out 1717 and the map has been re-engraved. Let me look at the catalogue record and get back to you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Does anybody want to ask anything more? Okay, we have from Rafael Lotilla again. He's asking if these maps are accessible now. I suppose you mean digitally, right? Mopo?
Yes, I mean, all of the King's topographical maps are available now. I think we discussed this before the presentation, that it might be a nice idea, along with the presentation, to add links to where these images can be found as well, for you to go on your own journeys, I think.
Yes.
So yeah, I can supply links.
All right, I think that ends our question and answer portion. So Tom, sorry, Popo's asking again, can they be cited without need for prior permission since they are available digitally, right?
Yeah, on Flickr, that's right. I mean, obviously we would be very glad for wherever the images are used for their source to be added. This is really helpful for researchers if they know that this is where it's come from, the British Library. But there's no obligation, of course. I mean, these are public domain. They're out there for you to use.
Okay. All right, Tom. So we look forward to your further research for those.
I've got some homework to do, haven't I?
Yes, sorry.
I must admit, I did not for 1 minute think I would be leaving this presentation without some homework. So thank you again, everyone.
Yes. Okay. Jimmy, would you like to say goodbye to Tom? Thank you.
Tom, can
Hi.
Hi, Tom. Thank you very much again, Tom, for such a wonderful and fascinating presentation. Your knowledge about the collection in the British Library is just incredibly impressive. And I must say the British Library's project to digitalize the collection of King George's maps and images is such a wonderful initiative, and making it available to all of us. Indeed, visiting the British Library is always a must for anyone going to London, which hopefully will not take too long before it's again possible. And of course, seeing you, seeing Rolly and our other friends in the British Library, we always look forward to that. And Tom, thank you for accommodating the requests of the attendees. We're giving you a little bit more work to do. But as we discussed earlier, once you've indicated the links to the maps in your presentation, we will upload it in the website of PHIMCOS. And any other relevant links that you think might be helpful to the members, please send it over and we will likewise upload it in the website. So Tom, thank you very, very much on behalf of the board and the members of PHIMCOS. We appreciate it very much. Thank you. And thank you to all of the attendees for attending and those who had asked questions for your participation in this evening's event. I'd just like to say that we are scheduling a webinar approximately every month moving forward. And the next webinar will be on Portuguese maps in the Philippines, and that will be on the 24th of February. And we will send the appropriate advisory once we get all of the details in place. Thank you. And Tom, you of course are always welcome to attend our webinars as well. Okay, Jay.